Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Psychology from My Kitchen. I'm Mrs. Sarah Ryan, and I'm not really sure why. Oh, there it goes. Today, we are continuing to talk about operant conditioning. And in our last lesson, we talked about reinforcements and punishments and how reinforcements are attempting to increase or continue a particular behavior, and punishments are trying to decrease or stop a particular behavior. It's actually a little bit more complicated than just like Thorndike's law of effect, where behaviors that are rewarded are more likely going to continue. We got to look at how does this actually work? And so we have to take a harder look at reinforcement. So we know that in reinforcement, I am increasing a future behavior by either giving my subject something that they like or taking away something that my subject doesn't like. And in order for this to be really successful, we have to look at what some of these elements are. A lot of times, especially in instances of parenting, and we start talking about using operant conditioning in a very real world type of scenario, that people understand a little bit of operant conditioning, and they don't realize that there's this whole other element to operant conditioning, which is all about what we use as reinforcers themselves. So first of all, to be an effective reinforcement technique, you need to know your subject. That what works for one subject is not necessarily going to work for another subject. So that's something to always keep in mind, that the better you know your subject, the better that you potentially could be at reinforcing or increasing the likelihood for behavior to happen. So first of all, we're going to talk about some specific types of reinforcement today, in that we have what's known as a primary reinforcer versus a secondary or a conditioned reinforcer. A primary reinforcer is going to be something that your subject finds innately satisfying, meaning they don't need to learn that it's a good thing, it's just a good thing. They just know that internally about that kind of reinforcement. Your most obvious kind of primary reinforcement is going to be food. That food is something that is innately satisfying to almost every organism, that would be something that would be considered a primary reinforcer, because the subject doesn't have to learn that it's a good thing, especially if they're hungry. Now, obviously, we can get into details about using Chipotle or Chick-fil-A as a primary reinforcer versus Brussels sprouts or beets. Some people not really a real fan of those kinds of vegetables. So even though yes, it's food, it might not really be a primary reinforcer given your subject's taste. Another kind of primary reinforcement could be something like affection. Most people don't really have to learn that affection is a good thing, like hugs and kisses and all of that, and snuggles, that it's just, something that is innately satisfying. But then we have secondary or conditioned reinforcers. And these are types of reinforcers that your subject has to learn that they are satisfying. They have to learn that it's something that would be a good thing. And so one of your most basic kinds of conditioned or secondary reinforcers is going to be money. I always use the example about if you're potty training a young child, can you get them to use the toilet by giving them a $20 bill? The answer to that is probably no, because a 2-year-old has no mental capacity as to what the heck you're going to do with a $20 bill. They're probably going to rip it in half or shove it in their mouth or something like that. That is not something that they have learned as being satisfying. And so your conditioned or your secondary reinforcer, that's got to be something that your subject has learned is satisfying. So you have primary reinforcers, which are innately satisfying, and conditioned reinforcers. You also think about dogs, because quite honestly, I can hear my one dog buddy tapping around right now. That with my dogs, if I want them to go outside and to pee outside or whatever, like I'm gonna use cookies to do that. I'm gonna use dog treats because to them those are innately satisfying. If I tried to give my dog money to go outside and do his business, there's nothing going with that. So primary versus secondary or conditioned reinforcers. Then we can't negate or forget about this whole other element to learned behavior, and that is the motivation of your subject, right? Like human beings, especially kids, they're not like just these little minions, these little peons that are just, there for your molding. Like they've got their own kind of agendas, their own types of ideas. And so we can't forget about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation that people might have for doing a particular behavior. Intrinsic motivation is where I feel motivated to do a particular behavior because I have a desire to do this behavior for its own sake. Like I might engage in an activity because I just really enjoy it. A couple of years ago, I started taking dance classes again. I am not ever going to become a professional dancer. Like that's not going to happen. I'm not going to make money off of doing this. It's just something that I enjoy. And so practicing as a 30 something mother, ballet, that, I'm not going to really get anything out of it except that I want to do this. And so that would be something that you would be intrinsically motivated to do because it's something that you're finding satisfying within yourself. Extrinsic motivations, on the other hand, are where we perform behaviors because of the desire or promise of a reward or potentially the threat of a punishment. And so this is where I am only doing a behavior because of the money on the other end, or the trophy that I might get, or the letter jacket. Like, there's some kind of ideal that you're thinking that you're going to get, or you're being threatened by somebody, like you will do this, or such and such consequence is going to happen. Like that is an extrinsic motivation for somebody to utilize. Now, we also know that timing and the involvement of timing in our reinforcement is going to play a big role too, in that we have what's known as immediate reinforcers and delayed reinforcers. Skinner did an awful lot of research dealing with pigeons and whether or not pigeons would peck at different color lights in that operant chamber, and if they would be willing to receive an immediate yet smaller reward in the form of a food pellet versus having to do a more complicated behavior and getting a delayed reinforcement, but that reinforcement being larger. And that while we might think that humans and pigeons are always going to go for that immediate thing, that's not always the case. That there is an element where we understand that this delayed reinforcement that is greater from my immediate need, that I don't always succumb to that kind of behavior. Like the difference between driving through a McDonald's or a Burger King or a Chick-fil-A or something like that, where, boom, I'm gonna get some excellent service there and I'm gonna get a great meal, versus like taking the time to go and get ingredients from the store and cook with my family and enjoy this nice family meal together that is likely going to be fewer calories than what I might have consumed from a drive-through, where like that drive-through was immediate, like boom, I got my food, I got my hunger on, like yay me. But I understand that it might take me longer to make this meal, but I might have a better experience with it. And so we don't always fall victim to the immediate reinforcement kind of, brouhaha that some people might assume about people. Now, The other aspect to reinforcement and the timing of reinforcement is how frequently are you going to reinforce a particular behavior. So we have what's known as continuous reinforcement versus partial or intermittent reinforcement. And that's going to work something like this. So continuous reinforcement would tell me that every single time that a particular behavior is met, that I am going to reinforce it. I am going to reward that behavior if I'm using a positive reinforcement kind of technique. So I often use the example that in my classroom, that if I wanted to increase hand raising behavior from my students, I could start giving out dollars. And that every single time that a student rose their hand and answered my question correctly, I'm opening up my wallet and I'm giving them $1. And the question inevitably is, would students start raising their hands? And they all start, raising their hands in class because, yeah, I'm going to start getting paid for raising my hand. So a continuous reinforcement is actually super effective in getting a behavior to really start going like, oh yes, I am raising my hand. However, it's also very, very linked to extinction, where the day that I run out of dollars, or the day that it's not me and it's a substitute teacher and they're looking for hand raising behavior, that behavior is immediately going to stop. So a continuous reinforcement is going to be very good at quickly changing a behavior. It's also really susceptible to extinction because as soon as the reinforcement is gone, the behavior is gone. So if I wanted to make long-lasting behaviors, I need to change, how frequently I'm going to reinforce this. And that's where this partial or this intermittent reinforcement kind of comes in. That instead of reinforcing the behavior every single time, which does mean that I'm going to have a slower acquisition, like it's going to take longer for me to get this behavior where I want it to be. It is also less likely going to go extinct. So if I want some like long-term behavioral changes, I shouldn't look at reinforcing the behavior every time. I should look at stretching that out longer and potentially giving, a longer reward. So with our partial reinforcement, we actually have what's known as different reinforcement schedules. And we have 4 different reinforcement schedules. Before you get all overwhelmed, let's break down what each of these terms are going to mean. So our first term that we come across is something that is fixed. And the word fixed means that it is fixed, right? It's something that is not changing. It's something that is staying the same. It is something that is staying constant. It is fixed. Whereas variable is going to refer to something that changes. And so variables are changing. Variables are not going to stay constant. They are not consistent. They are varied. And so we have fixed and we have variable. Then we have ratio and we have interval. Ratio is going to refer to a number of behaviors, or like a number of responses. And so when something is a ratio, we're saying that an amount of something needs to be achieved. Whereas an interval is going to refer to a period of time. And so I have a 5-year-old right here. Yes, dear. I see that. I see that. Actually, I need your help. I need your help with my video. Because can you find me your reward chart that's over there? It's right over there on the counter. Because I just want to show my students. Yeah, go ahead. Give me a second. We're back, and I'm back with my assistant. Can you tell everybody your name?
Emma.
And Emma, how old are you?
5.
You're 5?
But not 5.5 though.
No, not yet. Okay. We're gonna Actually, we're going to make Mommy's screen bigger to show the students here. Okay, can you hold this up for the camera? Yeah. What is this, Em?
A sticker chart.
What's your sticker chart for? Can you talk about it?
I use up for brushing my teeth.
Mm-hmm.
Getting dressed, cleaning up toys, helping puppies. That means like feeding them and going outside and helping Mama and Daddy.
Very good. And how many times do you have to do each of these things? How many rows do you fill up? What's the number?
5.
No. There's 5 different ones. How many do you?
7.
Yeah, you have to do these 7 times. And then what happens once you fill up your chart?
I get money to put in my piggy bank.
You sure do.
And my teddy bank, because I have a teddy one too.
You sure do. Thank you for being my assistant. You can go play now, okay? Okay. All right. So my lovely 5-year-old assistant was actually just sharing with you guys one of the reinforcement schedules. And in fact, she was demonstrating what's known as a fixed ratio schedule. So Emma's good old responsibility chart here is going to have a number of behaviors that need to be accomplished before she is going to be rewarded, before she is going to get her reinforcement. And so for her, we know that this is a fixed interval, or excuse me, a fixed ratio schedule because we have a designated number of behaviors that need to happen that's not changing. And we're talking about an amount of behavior as opposed to a period of time. And so we have a fixed ratio schedule. Now, a variable ratio schedule is going to be a schedule, I'm going to make myself smaller. A variable ratio schedule is where an unknown amount of behaviors has to occur before I get my reinforcement. This is often referred to as the gambler's schedule because this is like little old ladies sitting at a slot machine. How many, times do I press the button before I win the jackpot? Or like back in the day, you were actually putting, coins into the slot machine. That how many of those behaviors does it take to get my reward, to get that big cash payout? That in gambling, you don't know, right? And so you don't know if it's going to happen with this push or it's going to take 10 pushes or 20. Like there is some changing amount of behaviors that needs to happen in order for you to get your reinforcement. So variable ratio is actually the strongest kind of reinforcement schedule because it's so unpredictable. But then you also get people who burn out because they, never got a reinforcement. Then we have a fixed interval schedule. A fixed interval schedule is going to be a schedule of reinforcement in which after a specific amount of time has occurred, I'm going to get my reinforcement. And so this a lot of times happens like with paychecks, where when I talk to my students who have jobs at different restaurants or they work as lifeguards or they work in coffee shops and ice cream places, like those kinds of jobs, you often get like a weekly or a bi-weekly paycheck. And in that instance, you have a fixed interval schedule that reinforces you to come to work. Because on a random Tuesday that you're not getting paid, well, why would you show up for your shift that day? Well, because you know that every Friday you get paid. And because we're talking about an amount of time as opposed to a number of behaviors, that is a fixed interval schedule. Whereas a variable interval schedule means that there is a changing amount of time between you getting your reinforcement. So you might get a reinforcement the first time it was after 15 minutes, and the second time is after 5 minutes, and the next time is after 60 minutes. Like you don't know, right? That is a variable interval schedule. So it is a changing period of time between you getting your different reinforcements. So we have fixed ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval schedules. All of these schedules are going to work to a different extent. What is typically the problem, and I gotta say I'm kind of guilty of this myself, is that, we don't always follow the reinforcement schedule, but that should be okay, because this sticker chart hasn't been used in over a week, and she's still doing the behaviors that I want. And so, who's really winning here? Until next time, you guys have a great day. Thanks for joining me.